Hi, my name is Carol, and in this section, we're going to talk about the best practices on how to dry your membrane. Now, did it sound a little weird when you first heard from Darren that you should dry your membrane after transfer? I know that for me, it sounded absurd. I actually have a vivid memory of my first PI training me on Western blotting and saying, whatever you do, don't let that membrane dry. If the lab catches on fire, put it on PBS and run with it. That's how strongly we're typically trained not to let our membranes dry. Well, now that you have heard from Darren on the science section, the science behind why we want to dry the membrane after transfer, you probably feel a little bit better about it. Remember that when we dry the membrane at this step, we end up having stronger, brighter, sharper bands at the end of our protocol. There is a good analogy to help you understand why drying the membrane after the transfer helps lock proteins in place. Think about when you eat eggs. If you eat your eggs and you immediately clean the plate, it's not a hard chore. But if you're in a hurry and you don't rinse, you don't soak, you wait a few hours before you wash that plate, it's going to take a lot of scrubbing to remove all of that egg yolk out of your plate. That's because that egg yolk has firmly bound to your plate. It's the same thing that happens when you dry your membrane after the transfer. The proteins bind very firmly to that membrane, which is exactly what we want so we can get those strong, sharper, bright bands at the end of the day. If it makes you feel a little bit more easy with the whole idea, remember that this whole drying the membrane after the transfer was part of the original Western blot protocol. And we probably just stopped doing that in the interest of time. If we're looking at very abundant proteins, it may not make that much difference drying the membrane after the transfer or not. But if we're looking at low abundant or hard to detect targets, that can be day and night. It can really help you obtain great bands at the end of your Western blot protocol. Now let's share some tips to make sure you make the most out of drying your membrane. The first thing is you want to make sure to fully dry the membrane. If you only kind of dry it, you're not going to harvest any of those great benefits of having sharper, brighter bands. So how long do you need to dry your membrane for? Well, unfortunately, that's going to depend. It's going to depend on the type of membrane you're using, as well as conditions such as air temperature and humidity. You want to make sure you let the membrane fully dry. So keep it at room temperature for at least 40 minutes, and if then you're still unsure that it is fully dry, let it be for a little bit longer. You can keep the membrane drying for a couple hours or maybe even overnight. Think about it. If you let the membrane dry overnight, you can actually use it as a stopping point. For example, if it is a Friday, you can start your Western blot, run your gel, do your transfer, and then let the membrane dry. Then you can take your weekend off and go back to your Western blot on Monday. How awesome is that? You get to enjoy your weekend. Before you dry your membrane, you want to rinse it with pure water. That step is important so that you can remove any salts or detergents or anything that could give unwanted background on your membrane. After you rinse it, you're going to place it in between two pieces of filter paper and just let it be. You don't want to rub it, you don't want to place any weight on top of your membranes. All of those things could create artifacts on your membranes. We also recommend that you use filter papers and not wipes, for example. Wipes have a tendency to bind to the membrane and they can get really sticky. Some people like to try using paper towels, but we also don't recommend using them to dry your membranes because they can imprint on your membrane and again give artifacts that we don't want to see. The reason why we place a filter paper on top of the membrane, not only under it, is to protect it from dust. Dust can once again give you background, which we don't want to have. Now remember that while there's no risk of over-drying your membrane, you want to make sure you keep it safe. Membranes are very fragile, so you don't want to just leave it on the bench when someone can come with the racket tubes and destroy it before you even have a chance to probe anything on it. Personally, I like to wrap them in aluminum foil, place them on a safe box until I'm ready to continue my protocol. Now, we always recommend that you keep your membranes dry at room temperature. We don't place them at 4 degrees because there's an increased chance of bacteria or even fungus growing on them because of the humidity. And we don't place them at -20 because we always have a chance of having ice crystals form on it. Now, another reason why we keep our membrane dry at that step when we want to keep it for prolonged storage is because if we keep it at 4 degrees in a solution, for example, things will tend to detach from it, so you may end up losing your signal. In summary, in this section we have talked about what are the best practices for drying your membrane. Make sure you follow all of those guidelines so you can have a great outcome for your Western blot. Now, let's watch Sally's video in the lab drying a Western blot membrane.